Biodiversity, Lesson 1.6, Kingdom Plantae. So what are the general characteristics of Kingdom Plantae? They're eukaryotic, multicellular organisms that carry out photosynthesis. And basically photosynthesis is the plant's way of taking sunlight and converting it into energy. Their cell walls contain cellulose, and they are thought to have evolved from green algae. The four main varieties are mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants. So the plant life cycle. So they vary among plants, but have some similarities. So plants go through an alternation of generations. So for example, one generation is the haploid generation, which is the Gamenophyte generation, and the other one is the diploid generation, which is the Sporophyte generation. So we can see both of those on the chart up there. So plants produce haploid spores, which grow into a haploid plant. Eventually, these haploid plants produce gametes that fuse to produce a diploid zygote. So then the diploid zygote is the end part, and that is what produces the plant. So now we can see the two different types here. So at the top, we have the sporophyte, and then at the bottom, a little bit more green and moss-like is the Gamenophyte. So now we have to start breaking down the different phylum, just like we did for the other kingdoms. So the first one is non-vascular plants, or bryophytes. So that means that they don't breathe like other plants do. They're non-vascular. And these plants lack true roots, stems, and leaves. They don't have specialized tissue to carry out nutrients for them. So these specialized tissues are xylem and phloem, and these plants don't have that. We'll learn a little bit more about them later on. They only grow in dense, moist, small areas, and they grow to small sizes as well. To reproduce sexually, they need water, and to reproduce asexually, they need to go through vegetative reproduction. So here are the three examples, or the phylum, that non-vascular plants break down into. We have liverworts, moss, and hornworts. So I'll let you guess which ones are which, and then I'll write them in the blanks. So these ones over here are hornworts, these ones over here are moss, and these ones are liverworts. And you can tell what they are just based on their shape. So next we have vascular plants, so they breathe, tracheophytes. They do contain those transport vessels we were talking about, xylem and phloem. So xylem carries the water and phloem carries the nutrients. Now vascular plants break down even more into two main categories, seed producing and spore producing. Now it actually breaks down into even more categories for seed producing, which is gymnosperms and angiosperms. So gymnosperms are seeds in cones, and to give you a little bit more of a visual on that, it has male and female parts. So the male cones produce the pollen grains and the female cones produce the ovules. When the pollen is released, it drifts to the female cone where it produces a sperm, and the seeds are fertilized. Then once those seeds are fertilized, they form what is known as a zygote. This is where new plants will soon form. And those are the four examples that fall under that category. And you'll see this more when I break it down into the tree diagram to help you organize it better. The next category under seed producing is angiosperms, which is otherwise known as flowering or fruit plants. They all produce sexually with flowers and pollination. Flowers contain male and female parts that become fertilized by pollination. So what pollination is when a bee or a butterfly or another type of insect comes over to the plant because it's attracted to its nectar. Once it's attracted to the nectar, it picks up little pieces of pollen, and it can place those pieces of pollen on another part of the plant itself or another plant altogether. So those are the two ways. So we have self-pollination, which is the same flower, and cross-pollination, which is another flower. And cross-pollination is very important for genetic diversity because then we get all sorts of different types of plants. So once that part of the flower is fertilized, it then creates what is known as the fruiting plant. Once that is created, it's going to drop, or it's going to go somewhere and it's going to get dispersed and it's going to get carried. These methods of seed dispersal are wind, so it could get carried off by the wind, it could fall into the water, or it could hook onto the fur of some animal, or an animal could actually physically eat the fruit and then excrete it out. And then angiosperms lastly break down a little bit further into some subcategories, into monocots and dicots. So the last one, we have spore producing. So this one was the other one, remember, of the breakdown of the tracheophytes. So it's a really easy breakdown. We just have club moss, horsetail, and ferns. So those are the examples there. So this one up here is club moss, then we have horsetail, and then we have ferns. So they're super easy to tell the difference between. And now that we understand the different breakdown, I'm actually going to draw out a tree diagram so that you can understand and see where the categories fall under, because I know it gets a little bit confusing when you just see words on a screen. So we're going to start off with our domain, which is Eukarya, and our kingdom, which is Kingdom Plantae. Our first one is going to break down into Bryophytes. So that's our little subkingdom, kind of. And that breaks down into the three phylum that we saw at the very start, which is the moss, the liverworts, and the hornworts. On the other side, it breaks down into another little subkingdom, which is the Tracheophytes, remember, the vascular plants. So then now it gets a little bit more confusing where we break it down into two more categories. So Tracheophytes break down into spore producing and seed producing. So the spore producing break down into three phylum of its own: club moss, horsetails, and ferns. And then the seed producing breaks down into two more little categories: gymnosperms and angiosperms. And then if you remember, the gymnosperms break down into four more of their own phylum. So those are examples of that. And lastly, angiosperms, it doesn't really have phylum of its own, but it does have little subclasses, which are monocots and dicots. And in our plant unit, we'll learn a little bit more about those. So now you have this whole breakdown and this chart, which can help you show where each phylum falls under which category. And you could be asked to redraw this, or you could just know it and practice it so that you understand where each of these fall under. And that's it. Thank you for listening.